On the 1st of March 293, the two Augusti of the Roman Empire had announced to the world that the Romans have two new Caesars. In the city of Milan, Augustus Maximianus had appointed Flavius Valerius Constantius as a Caesar, and in Sirmium, Augustus Diocletianus had appointed Galerius Valerius Maximianus. According to many Roman historians, both of the generals had divorced their wives to marry into the families of the two Augusti. Constantius married Maximium's daughter Flavia Maximiana Theodora, while Galerius had married Diocletian's daughter, Galatia Valeria, although Constantius may have already been married to Theodora if the historian Timothy Barnes is to be believed. Constantius' son Constantine had been sent to the court of Diocletian in order for him to get his education and experience in the military. It's also been suggested that he's been held as a hostage to ensure Constantius' loyalty, which may also be the case. Nevertheless, this decision had proven to be useful to Constantine, as he gained experience by serving in multiple military campaigns alongside Caesar Galerius. This Galerius is partially of barbarian descent from his mother's side, and he had started life as a simple herdsman before he joined the military, where he rose through the ranks through the 3rd century crisis. He had been described by the historian Lactantius to have a tall stature, an imposing physique, and a very rough personality, which intimidated whoever that came near him. If his bust is an indication of anything, he probably wasn't the most pleasant person to gaze upon. He was described by many as an impetuous soldier, ambitious and ill-tempered, but to Diocletian, his most important attribute was his loyalty. Within the Tetrarchy, each emperor had been assigned to their own regions. Diocletian had put himself in command of the provinces in the east, from Asia to Egypt. Maximiam had commanded Spain, Africa, and Italy. Constantius had Gaul, Germania, and Britain, and Galerius had Greece and the Danube. Although the case with Diocletian and Galerius was more flexible, for sometimes Diocletian had been on the Danube while Galerius was on the eastern provinces. Each emperor would also have their own armies, courts, and palaces. The historian Aurelius Victor had described the Tetrarchs as uncultured men that came from the mountainous regions of Illyria, who despite their lack of noble character, were brought up with the hardships of rural life and war. Trained by great generals like Aurelian and Probus, they ruled together in harmony, which was the greatest value of the state. After Galerius' coronation ceremony was over, Diocletian had escorted Galerius to the city of Byzantium before returning to Sirmium. Galerius then moved on to Egypt to tackle the Blemmy's raiders. He might have encountered a revolt in the city of Basiris and Coptos, for it was mentioned in Jerome's chronicle, but there are no details about it, and there are no contemporary sources that mention it, so it's possible the chronicle was actually referring to a later revolt that occurred in the year 297 and misattributed it to 293. Whatever happened there, his campaigns against the Blemmy's must have been successful, for the panegyrics mentioned the trophies Galerius had taken from his victories over the Ethiopians. Meanwhile in the west, Constantius had been given the task of handling the problem of Carausius. After Maximium's disastrous loss of his fleet, the two Augusti had conceded a peace treaty with Carausius, which Carausius had used to bolster his own legitimacy. On the coins minted under his reign, we see the images of the three Augusti standing next to each other. But Diocletian and Maximium didn't seem to reciprocate his sentiments, for Carausius is completely absent in their coins, and their panegyric still depicts him as a rebel tyrant. But according to the historian Stephen Williams, he didn't seem to have lived up to that reputation. According to Stephen, Carausius' reign would have been popular among the people in Britain and northern Gaul. The stability of his reign allowed merchants to move freely across the channel, and his mints had minted silver with a higher silver purity than the ones made by the Tetrarchs. It's also peculiar that when Maximium was busy fighting the Germans, Carausius didn't try to exploit the situation to expand into Maximium's domains. Nevertheless, his mere existence is still a problem for the Tetrarchy, as his success would have inspired others to rebel. But removing Carausius had proven to be difficult. Not only did he have Rome's navy, but the 3rd century crisis had also forced the Romans to create new kinds of fortifications along the coasts of Britain and Gaul, which at this point in time were being used against the Tetrarchs. To overcome these defenses would require Constantius to use all the resources at his disposal, and in the year 293 he concentrated it on the city of Caesarium. However, the Romans had learned how well these newly designed fortifications worked against their state-of-the-art weaponry, as the siege towers and battering rams had failed to overcome the defenses. With a direct assault seemingly infeasible, Constantius had ordered his men to blockade the city from the sea by sinking a line of boulders at the entrance of the harbor to prevent reinforcements from Britain coming to their aid. With the rebels trapped in the city and Constantius' large army surrounding them, the Caesar gave the garrison generous terms of surrender, and they accepted. Carausius' reputation was lost, trade was disrupted, and the troops that had supported him in Gaul had defected to Constantius. Soon afterwards, he was assassinated and replaced by his finance minister Electus, who tried to reach a compromise with Constantius. Constantius instead started the construction of a new navy. This new navy would have taken months to build, so Constantius had spent the rest of the year leading his troops against the Frankish tribes in the swampy marshlands of the Scheldt, mainly against the Chamavi and Frisians. Constantius' orator had noted how these lands had been difficult to traverse, as the marshlands and bogs absorbed the feet of those who tread upon them. Nevertheless, the powerful forces of Constantius' armies had made many of the tribes flee to the forest until they were forced to surrender. And then he settled the men and their families in vacant lands around the Roman Empire as colonies, where they would farm the fields and provide soldiers for Rome. Diocletian in the meantime had conducted a successful campaign against the Sarmatians in the summer of 294. Panegyrics boasted that almost the whole people were wiped out. Of course, an over-exaggeration, but the Sarmatians had been quelled for a couple of years, giving Diocletian time to inspect and fortify the Danubian defenses. By the year 295, Galerius had moved to the city of Antioch to face another threat from the Sassanids. Within the Sassanid Empire, the Sassanid Emperor Blume III had been overthrown by Narses, his uncle and a son of Sapor. The details of this coup had been inscribed in the walls of a tower located in Asoristan, but some of the words had been eroded away. From what we can gather from what remains of the inscriptions, it says that a man named Wanam, on the insistence of the evil spirit Ahriman, had crowned Blume king of the Sakas as king of kings without informing the other lords. As a response, the other lords had supported Narses' claim to the throne as he marched from Armenia towards the tower to meet them. Wanam and Blume, with the support of R.A.B, the king of Mesan, had assembled their own forces in response to Narses. However, there are no surviving inscriptions of a battle between them, and it's possible that Wanam and Blume may have just given up the throne to Narses. Anyways, this new king of kings would prove to be more ambitious than the previous two rulers. Narses had undone many of the internal policies set by Blume II. The persecutions that had suppressed the Manichaean religion during the reign of the two Blumes had been lifted by Narses. He would also undermine the treaty signed between Blume II and Diocletian by making a show of force in his western provinces. He might have fought the Romans in 295, for the Tetrarchs had given themselves the title Persecutors Maximus for the year. Back in the west, the Romans had finished building their new navy, and Constantius had assembled his forces for an invasion of Britain. By this point, 3 years had passed since he removed Carausius' possession in Gaul. Much care and preparation had taken place to ensure that this invasion force would not end as disastrously as the one undertaken by Maximiam, so this time Constantius had assembled 2 fleets. Constantius had commanded the fleet that would sail from Caesarium, while his Praetorian prefect Asclepiodotus commanded a fleet from the Seine. Maximiam had also been stationed near the Rhine to ensure that the Alemanni doesn't attack Gaul when Constantius was busy fighting Electus. The sheer size of this force would be enough to overwhelm Electus' army, so Electus' best chance of survival lay on destroying Constantius' forces before they landed ashore. So Electus had prepared an ambush near one of the landing zones close to the island of Vectus. Both sides would have sent their scouts out to monitor the movements of their opponents, but Constantius had sent the fleets out in the rain. Constantius himself would sail along the straits while Asclepiodotus moved towards the southern part of Britain. When the rain stopped, a thick mist blended with the surface of the sea, which allowed Asclepiodotus' ships to slip past Electus' navy and land near Clausentum. As soon as all of his men had disembarked from the ships, he had the entire fleet burned in dedication to Mars before he marched towards the city of Londinium. When Electus had discovered the invasion, he had rushed his troops together to block the route to the city, but due to his inexperience and the hastiness of the assembly, he had been defeated and killed in battle against Asclepiodatus. The surviving Frankish mercenaries were left leaderless, so they rushed back to Londinium to loot whatever they could before making their escape, but Constantius' forces landed on the southeast and intercepted them. With the surviving mercenaries being caught by the forces of Constantius and Asclepiodatus, they were slaughtered. The panegyric mentioned that the killings had made a spectacle for the people of Londinium, so by the end of 296, the British provinces had been completely under the Tetrarch's control. While Constantius had concluded the British expedition, in the east, Narses launched his attack towards Armenia and defeated the Armenian king Tiridates before raiding Roman Syria. Galerius, with the support of Tiridates, had engaged Narses somewhere near Callinicum and Carrhae, but was defeated. We don't have much details on how he was defeated. Many Roman sources say that Galerius was heavily outnumbered, but being impatient for glory, decided to fight Narses anyways. All we know is that he lost the battle and was forced to retreat. Diocletian in the meantime had spent the campaign season fighting a war against the Carpi, before he went to Syria where he met Galerius as he was traveling on the road towards Antioch. We can only guess as to how the conversation between Diocletian and Galerius had gone, but it didn't seem to go well for Galerius, as Diocletian famously had shamed him by forcing him to run beside his chariot for several miles towards the city. Around the same time, the people of Egypt rose in revolt. We don't have an exact date on when they revolted, and the sources didn't explicitly state why they had occurred, so the reasons had to be theorized by historians. Some theorized that Galerius' defeat had enticed them to revolt, while others assumed that Narses had used agents to ferment revolution. What seems to be most convincing is that the revolt has been caused by Diocletian's new tax system that was promulgated in Egypt. We don't know how much influence Galerius' defeat had on the minds of the Egyptians, but the revolt was not born out of pure opportunism. The tax edict of Optasius was announced across Egypt in the 16th of March 297, which had removed many of the tax privileges from the people of Alexandria in an attempt to reform the tax system across Egypt. The revolt most likely didn't occur before that date, because a panegyric that was released to Constantius on the 1st of March 297 had mentioned many events within the Tetrarchy, but nothing about a revolt in Egypt, while another panegyric released in 298 had spoken about the revolt as if it's already been concluded. It would also have been a bad time to announce new taxes on a people that's already revolting against you, so the revolt must have occurred sometime after the edict and ended somewhere in 298. The new tax edict came at a time of increasing needs in other parts of the empire, as the more peaceful times they had once lived in were long gone, so Diocletian thought it was time for the Alexandrians to give their contributions to the state. Unfortunately, the people of Egypt would have little concern for matters in other parts of the empire, and were adverse to taking on the burdens of taxation to defend a province most of them had never seen, especially when the emperor's priorities had always laid elsewhere, as their responses to help the Egyptians in their need were usually delayed. The taking of Alexandria would have been a difficult task, for it was a large metropolis second only to Rome. Many of the inhabitants were wealthy and well-educated, so they would be able to pay for large armies and have the technical skills required to build siege weaponry. They are also joined by many other cities in Egypt, which made the situation even more difficult for the Tetrarchs. They announced their own emperor named Domitius Domitianus, but many historians think he was a puppet of his general Achilleus. The Tetrarch's armies responded by besieging and occupying each rebellious city individually, while Diocletian himself had the task of besieging Alexandria, preferring to starve out the city rather than assaulting it head-on. Galerius, on the other hand, had stayed in Syria and reinforced his forces with the legions from the Danube, which possibly include the Goths if the 6th century historian Jordanes is to be believed. These reinforcements must have been useful in stopping Narses' advance while Diocletian handled the revolt in Egypt. Back in Alexandria, the usurper Domitius had died sometime in December, while the city had capitulated in the spring of 298 after 8 months of siege. Diocletian had executed Achilleus and several other ringleaders of the rebellion. However, a story was told that Diocletian, enraged by their treachery, resolved to slaughter every Alexandrian until their blood had reached up to his horse's knees. But during the killing, the horse unexpectedly collapsed with its knees on the ground, and Diocletian, true to his word, stopped the killing. This story is most likely apocryphal, but the humorous Greeks of Alexandria built a bronze statue in honor of this horse. With the siege of Alexandria concluded, Galerius, with the help of King Tiridates, had moved their armies into the mountains of Armenia. When Narcissus had heard that Galerius' army was on the move, he moved his own army to intercept them. The ancient sources didn't provide a lot of details about this campaign, with the Breviarium by Festus providing the most. From what we can gather, they say that Galerius had performed a reconnaissance with 2 other cavalrymen until they spotted a Sassanid encampment. Seeing an opportunity, Galerius gathered 25,000 men from the army and launched an attack on the innumerable columns of the Persian infantry. The Sassanids were surprised by this sudden attack, and they were not able to organize their armies in time, so they were subsequently slaughtered by the Romans. Narcissus himself was forced to flee the carnage in disarray, leaving behind his family, his harem, and a great quantity of treasures behind, a boast mentioned by many Roman historians for centuries to come. Galerius had taken Narcissus' family and the harem under his protection, while the army looted the Sassanid encampment. One soldier had even taken a bag of pearls, but threw away the pearls because he was unaware of their value. Even Lactantius, who was hostile to Galerius, conceded that it was a monumental victory. While all of this was occurring in the east, in the west, Constantius had returned to the Rhine to guard the frontiers, as Maximiam had left the area to find his glory elsewhere. The Moorish raiders that were defeated by a Roman governor back in 289 could not resist the wealth of Africa and Mauritania and raided again. Therefore, in the year 297, Maximiam resolved to make a permanent solution to the Moorish problem by crossing deep into the mountains and killing many of the Moorish raiders before driving the rest of them out of the mountains. When he concluded his campaign, he returned to Carthage on the 10th of March 298 before returning to Italy in 299. Unfortunately for Maximiam, his skills and experience in the military doesn't translate well into politics. It's been said that he terrorized the Senate by sentencing some of the leading senators to death. It's also been said that he violated hostages and had the prefect of Rome executed. There are not many details as to the nature of these persecutions. Some historians attribute it to his greed, others to his hot temper, but whatever the case was, his cruelty had been mentioned by several pagan and Christian authors. The other tetrarchs didn't seem to have nearly as many problems with the Senate as Maximiam. Back in the east, Galerius had raided deep into the Sassanid Empire. It seems like after Galerius had destroyed Narcissus' army, the Mesopotamian provinces had been left exposed, for Galerius had taken over the cities of Nispis and Ctesiphon within a few months. Then sometime during the winter of 298, Galerius had started negotiations with the Sassanid embassy. Narcissus had sent 2 ambassadors to negotiate on his behalf, R.A.B, his chief minister, and Persecutors, the head of the Sassanid army. The historian Petrus Petricus, writing in the 6th century, had preserved a detailed account of the negotiations. R.A.B had told Galerius that the Roman and Sassanid empires are the true eyes of the world, and that they should adorn each other instead of seeking each other's destruction. He also expressed gratitude for Galerius' generous treatment of the royal captives, and it was the custom for wise men like themselves to show magnanimity when the vicissitudes of fate turned against the defeated and then asked for their return. However, Galerius angrily retorts about how the Persians were able to sermonize magnanimity when they held poor Valerian as captive until he died, and then defiled his body afterwards. Galerius told the Sassanid ambassadors that he is well within his rights to act angrily against the Sassanids, but he behaved with moderation because it was the custom of his people to be merciful to their subjects and warlike to those who make wars against them. He then reminded the ambassador that the Sassanid king had put Roman kindness to the test, but by the resolve of Galerius, the captives would be returned to him. After the meeting had been concluded, sometime during the spring of the year 299, Diocletian had met Galerius at Nispis to congratulate him on his victory. The Romans had sent their own ambassador, Galerius' secretary and advisor named Zacharias Probus, to the Sassanids to tell them their demands and to give an account of the embassy. The Romans demanded that the Persians let go of their claims over Armenia, so that King Tiridates would be able to continue to rule it. The Romans would also take over the satrapies of western Armenia. and the Armenians would take over the fortress of Zintha, which is located somewhere in the Sassanid province of Media. The Romans also demanded that the Sassanid client state of Iberia would be under the control of the Romans through the king Miram. The Tigris River would be the border between the Romans and the Sassanids, and the Romans get to keep Nisbis. Narcius had some objections about Nisbis, but Sicurius said he's under no condition to change the deal. So before the end of spring, the peace treaty was signed, and Diocletian and Galerius returned to Antioch. With peace settled in the eastern front, Diocletian then ordered the army to give sacrificial animals to the gods, and those who refused would be dismissed from the army. Since the Christians had been forbidden by their religion to make sacrifices to the pagan gods, it seems like this order had been specifically made to target them, even though they weren't explicitly mentioned. Because of this, some historians assume the order had been conjured up by Galerius because of his anti-Christian stance. But Diocletian was just as likely to have created the order, for he did revive the worship of the old Roman gods, so it would have been very concerning to him if his soldiers had not paid their respects to them after they had assisted them through the hardships of many campaigns. On the other hand, the Christian writer Lactantius had said that the order came about after Diocletian and Galerius had consulted the Haruspics to receive divinations from the gods. The Haruspics would cut open a sacrificial victim, usually a goat or a lamb, to read out the gods' messages in the entrails. However, the Christians who were nearby drew crosses on their foreheads to ward off demons, so when the Haruspics read the liver, they could not find any signs. They tried again with other animals, but they still could not find the signs in any of the entrails. Finally, the chief Haruspics named Tagus declared that the sacrifices were being interrupted by impious men that surrounded them. This had angered Diocletian enough to demand that everyone in the palace make sacrifice to the gods, before sending letters to his commanding officers for the soldiers to do the same. Whatever the case may be, by the end of 299, most of the Christian soldiers in the east had left the army. While all of this was going on in the east, warfare had erupted again in the west. A panegyric written for Constantine in the year 310 had written about the various battles that Constantius took part in, but the descriptions are vague, and as usual, the panegyric didn't give dates on when they had occurred. Timothy Barnes did whatever he could to put these events in order, and according to him, these events occurred between the years 300 to 304. Within these years, Constantius may have fought the Franks again after the capture of Britain, for the orator had mentioned the campaigns against them twice, but he may also be referring to the same campaign. The orator had also mentioned multiple battles Constantius had against the Alemanni. In one campaign, Constantius and his men had been ambushed and wounded by the Alemanni, which forced them to retreat to the fortress of Langres. However, the garrison panicked and closed the doors before Constantius had arrived. Not wanting to open the doors again, they threw a rope over the walls and pulled them into the fortress, and the Alemanni departed. In another encounter, the Alemanni had fought the Romans near Vindonesia, which resulted in a 6-hour battle that ended in a Roman victory. The Romans claimed to have killed around 60,000 men of the Alemanni, no doubt an over-exaggeration, but the victory is monumental enough to be mentioned in multiple sources. There is also another event where the Alemanni crossed the Rhine during the winter when the river had frozen over, but melted away before they were able to get to the other side, so they all ended up being stuck on an island. The Roman navy then surrounded the beleaguered Alemanni and forced them to surrender some of their men, most likely to serve in Rome's armies, and let the rest return home. By the year 305, the conflicts with the Germans seemed to have ceased, as Constantius had moved to Britain. Simultaneously, Galerius had spent those same years fighting against the Carpi along the Danube, as evidenced by the many victory titles and praises in the panegyrics. Now back to Diocletian, the emperor had returned to Egypt in the year 301. At this point, his new administration and tax edict were in operation, so he spent the year managing the local affairs within the province. He cleared and repaired irrigation canals, brought unused lands under cultivation, and created 2 new cities near Coptos, called Diocletianopolis and Maximianopolis. He also imported a tribe called the Nobades into the southern part of Egypt to prevent further incursions from the Blemmies. However, inflation still seemed to remain a problem for Diocletian, for he had issued the Edict of Maximum Prices. In many places around the empire, Diocletian had set up catalogs of goods and services along with their prices. In his edicts, he blamed inflation on the greed and avarice of the merchants, and prescribed harsh punishment to those who violated the edict. The strictness of these measures had revealed Diocletian's frustration. After all, he had painstakingly defended the provinces, repopulated abandoned areas, and began minting coins with a higher silver purity. The security he brought to the empire should have stabilized the price of goods, but he still received complaints from his men that the prices were exceedingly high. Unbeknownst to Diocletian, his mere presence could have been the cause for inflation. Wherever the emperor went, he would be accompanied by his consistory, his army, and many other attendants. The arrival of thousands of people would have been burdensome to the supplies in their local provinces, evidenced by the stream of letters that were sent to Diocletian, filled with complaints and excuses regarding the supplies. In the end, the edict was unenforceable, so it had silently died out. But at the very least, modern-day historians are able to see what the ideal price of goods and services was for the time period, so we can get some idea of how things cost back then. Another thing that was brought to Diocletian's attention was the religion of Manichaeism. This religion, which had originated from the Sassanid Empire, was a relatively new creation compared to the other faiths, and their followers had zealously spread the religion throughout Egypt. However, after the revolt, there was some suspicion that some of the followers were agents of the Sassanid emperor, and the religion also had an open hostility against the Roman gods. Therefore, on the 31st of March 302, Diocletian ordered many of their leaders and their books to be burned. As for many of the followers, they would be either executed or sent to the mines with their goods confiscated. With the affairs in Egypt concluded, Diocletian had distributed free bread to the people of Alexandria and moved to Antioch during the autumn. During his time there, the local pagans were performing a ceremony before a Christian deacon named Romanus had interrupted the ceremony by protesting against him. The local authorities had arrested him and ordered his execution by fire, of which he gracefully accepted. When Diocletian had heard of this, he had intervened to have the man imprisoned with his tongue cut out instead. This entire episode must have perturbed Diocletian's pagan sensibilities, but he nevertheless continued his duties and moved on to Nicomedia, where he called for a meeting with several high-ranking men to discuss his next move.